Have you ever wondered what truly terrifies us? From the cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft, and the seductive brutality of vampires, and even the relentless onslaught of the undead, here are three movies that truly scared the hell out of me when I first saw them, and still do to this day. Number one on the list is Aliens from 1979. I saw this movie when I was probably 10 years old, and it scared the absolute dog shit out of me. The Xenomorph was so much scarier than anything else I had ever seen before in Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street. The special effects were so much better, and this thing stuck with me, from the face huggers to the bursting out of the chest.
Oh, God!
The gore and just the atmospheric dread of the entire movie was genius, and it gave me nightmares. I'm not gonna lie, it's probably the first monster that sat in my nightmares for several nights. When trying to find what subgenre this movie fit in, I found that a lot of people thought it was Lovecraftian. Lovecraftian horror is defined by cosmic dread, ancient evils, and the exploration of how truly insignificant humans are in the grand scale of the universe. Lovecraftian horror was born in the early 1900s, a product of the Three Musketeers of Weird Tales. Weird Tales was a pulp magazine way back in the 1930s that was contributed to by very, very many writers, but the Three Musketeers were Howard Phillips Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, and Clark Ashton Smith. My father always used to say that he thought that these three had a secret competition, though this isn't fact, just fan theory, that the three of them were trying to see who could come up with the most convincing evil grimoire. The most well-known by H.P. Lovecraft is the Necronomicon. We've also got the Book of Eibon, made by Clark Ashton Smith, and the Auspician Culton, or the Black Book, from Robert E. Howard. You might recognize the name Robert E. Howard because he was the writer of Conan the Barbarian, and a lot of them used these grimoires that they made up as mechanisms narratively for their stories, very similar to the Darkhold in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Fans to this day argue whether or not these writers were creating one linked world lore or if it was separate. And I think that's a lot of the fun of playing with their stories is you don't really know. The really scary part about this little contest my dad talks about is there were confirmed letters between Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft of him asking, the Necronomicon isn't real, right? Seeing as how Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born to one of the oldest families in New England at the time, some people think that it wasn't fiction, that this is something actually passed down from generation to generation. Of course, if you ask my father, he would tell you Lovecraft won that contest, hands down. There are many other wonderful, notable works that belong to this subgenre, and the first one I've got to talk about is John Carpenter's The Thing. An amazing movie. Kurt Russell, way back in 1982. There have been some remakes, but the original is still my favorite. Some crazy space alien falling from the skies that absorbs all organic life unto itself, making an amalgam of some horrible space monster. There are many other works that have Lovecraftian themes. First one we got to talk about is Berserk, of course. Not for everybody, but it definitely deals with interdimensional ancient beings that transcend the limits of time. We got Bloodborne, which directly references great old ones, or great ones, as the monsters that you're fighting for the majority of the game. Super Lovecraftian, completely dressed up in like early 1900s English aesthetic. It's very, very heavily influenced by this subgenre. And the last one that I actually didn't see coming was Season 1 of True Detective. I could do an entire separate video over how much I loved this show. It's one of the greatest cop dramas I've ever seen. Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson gave the performance of their lives in this series. And once you wrap it up, you start to realize that the Yellow King that influenced the killer, no spoilers by the way, just if you haven't seen it, the Yellow King is a Lovecraftian entity. And that's what's so terrifying about this subgenre, is Lovecraftian horror can happen in the far reaches of a spacefaring future, a fictional Victorian past, or even right here in present day, in the bayous of Louisiana. I'd like to distill down what I think each fear does for us psychologically. And I believe Lovecraftian horror is fear of the unknown. When I asked my dad, what does Lovecraftian horror mean to you? He said, imagine a knowledge or a truth so terrifying that you wish you had never learned it. The second movie on the list is 30 Days of Night. I must have caught this when I was maybe 13, 14 years old. And this was in the era of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Twilight. We'd seen so many versions of sexy, glittering, dressed-up vampires that this one completely took me off guard. Watching this group of ancient vampires completely tear their way through an entire Alaskan settlement in the dead of winter was absolutely terrifying. I had never been gripped with such a fear of a predator. There was nothing these people could do. Guns were ineffective. Most melee weapons didn't matter because they were so fast and so vicious that they'd rip through people like fodder. Adding to the terror of it was watching them have fun. It was like watching them play with their food. I'd never seen vampires depicted in such a visceral and disgusting way. This subgenre is not very hard to figure out, and it is, of course, vampires. But vampires span back to the dawn of our history. Looking into the origins of vampire lore, most people only go back as far as Bram Stoker, which is very important, but in searching through some of the etymological breakdown of the word vampire, vampires originate from very, very old Eastern European folklore. I went looking for the folklore that contributed to the vampire legend, and what I found were a lot of very old words. We find the Romanian strigoi, the Greek strix, and the Slavic upir. And I believe the Greek strix literally translates to screech owl. These were used to communicate the idea of a flying predator. These words combined with the idea of the Slavic vokudlak, which was a word to communicate the idea of a werewolf. Before Bram Stoker, you really could not distinguish the difference between a vampire and werewolf, as they were kind of the same thing. It's also thought that these legends were formed out of a social anxiety that ancient people had as they left behind a lot of ancient burial practices. It was customary through generations for them to leave offerings of food to satisfy the hungry dead. This is especially explored in the folklore of what are known as draugrs. I'm sure you've seen an iteration of this in Skyrim. The legends talked about angry spirits rising back out of the grave to take up their grievances with people who did them wrong during their lives. As strange as these stories seem, there's ample anthropological evidence to suggest that these beliefs were real, as many of these burial sites are set up with mechanisms to trap the bodies inside of their resting places, demonstrating a very real fear of these bodies getting back up out of their graves and attacking ancient people. I think most of these ideas were created to explain the phenomenon of plague and illness in an ancient world. You have to imagine these ancient people didn't understand germs, so when people got sick after maybe somebody died, they'd go and they'd dig up that body and they'd see maybe bloating or strange bleeding out of the eyes or nose, or maybe even a preservation by the cold that they didn't understand. So they built these stories to explain what was happening. If an illness had hit the village and someone recently died, their superstition would guide them to digging up their dead and making sure that they truly stayed dead. Nowadays, these are very, very explainable phenomenon, but to ancient people, this was evidence of them rising from the dead and attacking their settlements. Bram Stoker came along and combined a variety of these folklore elements with inspiration from real-life people like Vlad Tepes and Elizabeth Bathory to create the character known as Count Dracula. He did take some creative liberty, adding in an aversion to sunlight and holy symbols like the crucifix, and Also, them not being able to be seen in mirrors. Without Dracula, we wouldn't have vampires as they are today. This book served as a wonderful source material for movies like Van Helsing with Hugh Jackman, the Castlevania animated series, and my favorite, Interview with the Vampire. I can't give enough praise to Anne Rice. Even the 90s adaptation of Interview with a Vampire with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise is amazing. But they've managed to do even better recently with AMC's adaptation into a TV show style hour-long episode. As we've explored the vampire subgenre, I think that the fear that is distilled with this particular subgenre is fear of our past. The last movie on the list is 28 Days Later. I saw this when I was probably 15, 16 years old, and it took me off guard in a similar way as 30 Days of Night, but to a completely new level. Gone were the days of shambling undead bodies and welcome in the rage virus. This slight tweak to the zombie subgenre of creating the most vicious, fast, unrelenting, and brutal versions of zombies I had ever seen scared the hell out of me. We all know we've sat around and had conversations with our friends of how long or how we think we would survive a zombie apocalypse. But this was the first movie that I saw when I knew beyond the shadow of a doubt I wouldn't make it. I just can't run that fast. The zombie subgenre might be my favorite of all three, and it is definitely the one I've spent most time with. I think of all subgenres, this one has the most plentiful amount of video games. The furthest back I could trace zombies was to Haitian folklore. In Haitian folklore, zombies were not monsters, but were victims of warlocks and sorcerers who had their minds and their bodies corrupted by evil magics. These stories were created to communicate a fate so terrible that even death could not free you from it. I think that this was very clearly used to communicate the feeling of the people who were trapped in the transatlantic slave trade. And the theme of a zombie being used to communicate a criticism of society in a timely way, according to a particular era, carries on straight through into the grandfather of this particular subgenre, George A. Romero. He created a trilogy spanning 3 separate decades, starting with Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead. It's important to recognize that these movies are separated by a decade because each one of them serves as a societal criticism for that era. In Night of the Living Dead, he uses an African-American protagonist to give social commentary on the ridiculous attitude by some of the people who were alive during the Civil Rights Movement. In Dawn of the Dead, he uses the setting of a shopping mall to give a societal critique of rampant consumerism and materialism taking over society. In Day of the Dead, he tries to humanize the zombies, giving them some semblance of intelligence, and focuses in on a corrupt military organization that was trying to reinstitute some figment of the previous society. I think that this subgenre is unique in that the monster of the subgenre isn't the real monster of the subgenre. Zombies create a crisis in which we use these fictions to explore the inhumane, desperate, malevolent, evil ways that humans will treat each other in times of crisis. I believe that this monster is a fluid personification, taking on the most evil parts of society at that time. For notable works of this subgenre, I have to cite 2 of my absolute favorite franchises in video gaming. First is Resident Evil. Notably, Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 4, though very many of them are quite good. Those just happen to be my favorites. I gotta love Leon Kennedy. And The Last of Us is also one of the most heart-wrenching and compelling narratives I've ever experienced in video games. The beauty of this subgenre for video games is these are not the only ones. There are a variety of other great games like Days Gone and Left 4 Dead that are super fun. Not all of them are scary, and there's just a lot out there to explore. My favorite notable work from this subgenre is The Walking Dead. I was incredibly lucky to get into this show when it came out in Season 1 and followed it all the way through its height up into Season 6 and even the fall after Season 7, Season 8, and onward. I've recently refound the show through some of the spin-offs, Daryl Dixon and The Ones Who Live, and I'm very happy to see them making a bit of a comeback. I know the franchise is not what it once was, or what it ever could have been, but I still really love The Walking Dead. I believe that this subgenre is our current societal fears manifested. 28 Days Later came out in a post-9/11 landscape when we had an increased fear in anthrax and microbiological warfare. The Last of Us put an interesting spin on the microbiology, turning it into a fungal infection, very much like a cordyceps does to an ant. It makes me wonder how many more iterations of zombies we'll see throughout the decades. I hope you enjoyed this walk through some of my favorite horror subgenres and what these subgenres have given us in the way of movies, games, and television. I'd like to believe that these subgenres and the monsters associated with them give us a particular window into certain horizons of human fear. Sometimes it's essential to look into the darkness and prepare ourselves for the endless possibilities of reality. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you very much. And may you continue to find both strength and meaning in the monsters we choose to fight, both in fiction and in reality. Let me know what you guys thought. Happy spooky season, and I'll see you in the next one.